Stay tuned for tonight's adventure with the Fat Man.
Okay, here we go. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time of day it is. I hope it's good to be where you are, because I certainly didn't expect to be here today. My name is Baltimore Fats, and this is Two Guys in a Tombstone Pete. Yeah! All right, have fun, guys. All right, so we're going to start this one off with a few more words about Tombstone Pete, who decided he wasn't finished yet. Right? And so I'm going to assign him a proper avatar here. And again, all apologies to Silas Dean, whose appearance may not have been as accidental as I thought, because he's from my home state of Connecticut and was something of a traitor to the United States during the Revolutionary War. And he lives out the rest of his days in jolly old England. So we may come across Silas again. But moving forward, it turns out that at least one of my suspicions about Petey is correct. At least according to the gatekeepers, right? Because my mate Nick in Edinburgh was kind enough to feed Tombstone Pete and his administrators to the Chat GPT. And Gypty chatted up a storm, totally giving up Pete's administrators, Ebenezer Hazard and Matthew Clarkson, the men that auctioned off the contents of Tombstone Pete's museum. And so, starting with Matthew Clarkson, Gypty says that he was a prominent New York merchant, of course, right? Politician and militia officer who served in the Continental Army and later held multiple political positions in New York, including a one-year stint as mayor, and that he was a wealthy, connected figure. Right? I bet he was. And Gypty goes on to say that his involvement as Tombstone Pete's administrator likely reflects both the practical need for administrators and the transatlantic colonial networks of collectors and public men who acquired Americana. And so, essentially what Gypty is saying is that in the late 1700s, there was a pressing need for administrators, which Gypty equates with facilitators. I love that. And when you have a facilitator of things, people who want access to your services aren't too far behind. Maybe people like Ebenezer Hazard, America's third Postmaster General, whom Gypty tells us was active in both New York and Philadelphia publishing circles, and whose interest in historical material makes him a plausible acquirer/administrator of Tombstone Pete's papers and relics. And Gypty closes with that he too is named on the inventory as taking possession or purchasing effects. And so this is very curious language from Gypty. If his name is on the inventory list, then it's more than plausible, it's probable, if not factual as these things can get anyway, that he takes possession or purchases Pete's stuff. And there is a distinction between possessing and purchasing that I'm not sure Gypty is aware of. And from here, Gypty goes on to describe what could have become of the rest of Tombstone Pete's collection, though it does fail to mention that many of these effects ended up with Charlie Peel. And I find this very interesting. But now armed with this new information on Hazard and Clarkson, I wanted to see what else was out there. And so going in the order that they were presented to me, let's start by taking a closer look at Ebenezer Hazard. Philadelphia born and educated at Princeton, this is all Wiki tells us about his early life. Right? There's nothing on his parents or his family, and nor does it say what qualifies him to be the first postmaster of the city, and we're talking about New York here, after failing as a publisher. What is it about this failed publishing gig that makes him qualified to do this job? But according to Wiki, he parlays this into being a surveyor general of the Continental Post Office, and later he assumes the position of postmaster general from Richard Backey, our boy Dally's paternal grandfather. And after his brief stint as postmaster general, and it's brief because he gets fired by G-Dubs, who throws an orange man-sized tantrum after Ebenezer messes with his buddies in the stagecoach business. And G-Dubs accuses Ebenezer of being an opponent of the adoption of the Constitution, because while he's Postmaster General, Ebenezer does two things. First, he doesn't renew the delivery contracts with private stagecoach lines to deliver the mail. And then he places a tax on the transportation of newspapers over more than one state line. And so G-Dubs and some of his constituents looked at this as censorship against the Constitution, which had not yet been ratified. But nothing could be further from the truth, as Ebenezer was a staunch supporter of the Constitution, and this was just really an attempt to raise money for the fledgling post office. But G-Dubs holds a grudge and never talks to Ebenezer again, though he does remain close with TJ. So Mr. Hazard is a very interesting character in all of this. Buried but not quite hidden by the mainstream narrative because he is fairly well represented by the gatekeepers, unlike his co-administrator Matthew Clarkson, as we'll see down the line. But it's after this brief stint, something incredible happens, because he essentially co-creates the Insurance Company of America in 1792, which is the oldest capital stock insurance company in the United States. And it's still active today under the Chubb umbrella of insurance companies. Yeah, I'm sure those stockholders are chubby. and somehow this company earns $56 billion a year and has amassed $246.5 billion in assets. And it all begins with a failed tontine scheme, which was called the Universal Tontine Association. And so tontine schemes work like this. A large pool of people would buy shares in this company, and the investors would receive some form of annuity or other payment until they die. But tontine schemes are essentially death pools because once a subscriber dies, their payout gets split among the living. And so something like that could be very lucrative to a subscriber whose co-subscribers all die young, right? And so the hoi polloi in just about every major city tries to get one of these schemes off the ground to raise capital. But they all fail. And so the story goes that our boy Ebenezer invests in a failed tontine scheme in Boston run by his friend Samuel Blodgett Jr. And so after this scheme fails, he tells Sammy to screw Boston and come to Philadelphia, right? He had investors ready to go. But just like everywhere else, they fail to meet the set minimum of subscribers, and this scheme fails too. And so what's left is a bunch of guys sitting around on their money. And so Blodgett and Hazard convince what's left of the investors to start an insurance company instead. And they sell 40,000 shares at $10 a share in 11 days and raise $600,000 in capital. This is an incredible sum of money. Right, this is equal to $19.2 million today. And it is impossible to stress just how much buying power that would have been in 1792. In 1792, at $10 a pop, would make each share roughly $320 today. And so I have to ask, who was buying these shares? Because the average day laborer, the working middle class in 1792 was lucky to earn more than 50 cents a day. Think about that. That is 20 days worth of work for one share. So I doubt many people were giving up almost a month's pay to buy into this company. 40,000 shares is an incredible number to sell in 11 days at $320 a pop, right? And so, it's the wealthy and the elite that are starting this insurance company, of course, right? But it turns out to be a smart move for them because after launching, the INA starts selling, what do they start selling? That's right, fire insurance. And this becomes a very lucrative business for them given Western expansion. All those new cities being, built or founded, right? It's very lucrative for the insurance trade. And the INA had a sterling reputation, paying out its losses in full during the desolations of Chicago and San Francisco. And this begs the question to me is, how many of these buildings were owned by the shareholders of INA, right? Because interestingly enough, INA's reputation doesn't quite hold true in Baltimore, right? where many of the fire claims were discounted. I wonder why, right? I bet the suicided mayor Robert McLean knew why. And so it's just amazing to me that the co-founder of one of the biggest insurance companies in history and former postmaster general ends up as one of Tombstone Pete's administrators. And so this makes Ebenezer one of the prime candidates to be one of the people who paid Tombstone Pete to collect stuff. At the very least, all that Revolutionary War stuff. And I think this because of how Ebenezer uses all of that stuff. You see, Ebenezer here was the first American to attempt to preserve the documentary heritage of the nation when he publishes his 2-volume set, Historical Collections, consisting of state papers and other authentic documents intended as materials for an history of the United States of America. And the first volume was published in 1792. coincidentally enough, the same year he starts that insurance company, and also a good 9 years after the British were cranking out U.S. Revolutionary War books. And so the narrative around the American War for Independence just keeps getting muddier and muddier, right? Because Wiki is being more than a little bit disingenuous when they say that he quit the publishing business after 5 years. Because he utilizes these connections the rest of his life, and used this time in learning the mechanics and economics of printing books and pamphlets, and how to judge paper and styles of printing. And it's also around this time that he starts collecting pamphlets as well. And the author of this article notes that some of the rarest pamphlets in the Library of Congress today come from this collection. Right? So this is another thing we're starting to see a lot of. All of this source material coming from individual sources. It's just highly suspect to me, especially because our boy Ebenezer goes to England. Gee, I wonder who he visited. And Ebenezer's story just gets crazier, right? Because as mentioned, he went to Princeton, which was at the time known as the College of New Jersey, where his uncle, the Reverend Samuel Finley, was president. But before this, Finley founded the primary boarding school young Ebenezer was indoctrinated in, a little place called West Nottingham Academy in Maryland. Sherwood Forest? Anyone? Right? And this school was located on Fire Tower Road, of all places. So maybe young Ebenezer's road to selling fire insurance goes back this far. Who knows? But Nottingham and Sherwood Forest once again rearing their heads in Mud City. And to top off this look at Ebenezer Hazard, his father, Samuel Hazard, was a prominent Philadelphia merchant, of course he was, and original trustee to Princeton, or the College of New Jersey, and he marries a woman named Catherine, daughter of Matthew Clarkson. And when I read that, I was like, wait a minute, what? Is this the same Matthew Clarkson that serves as co-administrator to Tombstone Pete's affairs? Because if so, that would make him Ebenezer's grandfather. And so, before we find this out, let's take a look at what Googly can tell me about Gypty's Matthew Clarkson. And the answer is...
nothing! Absolutely nothing!
It at first appeared that Gypty just made him up, right? Because I scrolled and scrolled to no avail. All Googly would give me were these two guys. And so checking their dates against Gypty's dates of 1733 to 1825, one of these men is born in 1733, and the other one dies in 1825. So it looks to me like Gypty just created an amalgamation of these two Matthews Clarkson, essentially just combining their stories, right? And so this is a prime example of why ChatGPT just can't be trusted. And so I'm going to start with this Matthew Clarkson, who I don't think is our boy Tombstone Pete's co-administrator, but he does lead a pretty extraordinary life. And he connects to Mud City because he serves under Eddie's grandpa Benedict Arnold before he allegedly turned traitor. And Matty was also present at the surrender of Cornwallis. Right, this is quite a feat, serving under Benedict Arnold and also being at the surrender of Cornwallis. And he goes on to be president of the New York Bank, and he holds various New York political positions, but he never serves as mayor, so he's definitely not our guy. But one last note on Patriot Matty Clarkson is that he was a merchant too, who did business with a guy named Vanderbilt. Never heard that name before. But his contemporary, right, the other Matthew Clarkson, I'm certain that this was our guy, co-administrator to Tombstone Pete, because he was mayor, all right, but of Philadelphia, not New York. And Wiki doesn't offer up much on him at all. He's another dry goods salesman, Natch, and he owns a couple of boats, and he becomes involved in a Nova Scotian land deal that includes Benny Franks. And I'm kind of curious as to what happened to this land deal after the Revolution, but just given his ties to Philadelphia and the players therein, it just makes sense that he's our guy. But this is where the story starts to get ridiculous, because remember the Matthew Clarkson who was Ebenezer's maternal grandfather? Well, his wife Cornelia was the daughter of the 23rd mayor of New York, Johann de Peyster II. And so, besides giving birth to Ebenezer Hazard's mother, Matthew and Cornelia also give birth to one Matthew Clarkson, the mayor of Philadelphia. So making this Matthew Clarkson Ebenezer Hazard's uncle. And it also makes this Matthew Clarkson part of a grandfather-grandson team that serve as mayors in two of the biggest cities in America. How does that work? At the very least, I guess it demonstrates the influence of the Clarkson family at the time. Or maybe that's just my apophenia running wild. I don't know, because this gets even better when you learn that Patriot Matthew Clarkson's father, this David Clarkson, has a brother called Matthew Clarkson who just so happens to be Ebenezer's grandfather, making for one big happy family, right? I mean, these two Matthew Clarksons would be cousins. Patriot Matthew Clarkson would be cousin to Ebenezer, whose uncle is Matthew Clarkson, right? It's no wonder that Gypsy got confused. And so now we have Tombstone Pete involved with all of these aristocratic American families with ties to the shipping and dry goods trade, politics in two American cities, the beginnings of insurance monopolies, how the American Revolutionary War was chronicled, not to mention the Eye of Providence being on the Great Seal of America, and the rise of the museums. Right, this is just unbelievable. And even more unbelievable is I found no mention of any of these men being Freemasons anywhere. But Gypsy does hip us to the fact that Tombstone Pete did have dealings in Paternoster Row, meaning that he may have known or corresponded with some, if not all, of the players circulating around the Heart of Darkness, including this guy, the Grand Poobah. Alright, so that's all I have for this one. As with everything else, this needs a lot more work. And I left things out like Ebenezer's partner in founding the INA, Samuel Blodgett Jr. Well, he was involved in the city planning of Washington, D.C., and designed the first Bank of the United States building. And in another trope we see again and again with so many of these characters, he dies penniless in, of all places, Baltimore. Alright, so that's it for this one. Thanks again to my mate Nick for lighting a fire under my ass, and as I said in the last one, it could be a while before the next one, but you never know, right? This one came out of nowhere for me, and regardless, you just have to remember that just because you don't know the truth doesn't mean you can't have fun with the lies, right? So, cheers, guys.